2 years ago, I was voted most likely to become an animal activist by my classmates. And I must admit, I was slightly disappointed by this. Although animal welfare is important, my main motivation for turning vegan was actually the environment. Moreover, the phrasing of the terms most likely and become implied that the role of an activist could only be assumed by a future version of myself. It suggested that I couldn't be an activist until it was a full-time job. So prior to this talk, I conducted a brief study asking people to share the first thing that came to mind when they heard the term activism. Most responses related to protests, vocal advocacy, and campaigning. What I concluded is that many associate the term activism with this. People flocking the streets, holding up signs, and fighting for a cause. Although the dictionary definition and the many definitions put forward by the participants of the study both emphasize the use of vigorous action to confront change, my understanding of this term is slightly different. I believe that activism can be achieved through our everyday actions and should be integrated into one's lifestyle. So just over a year ago, I was enjoying a vegan meal with another friend. As we ate, we began to chat about the common misconceptions that surround veganism. More specifically, the perceived lack of vegan options in Hong Kong. Considering that meat consumption is the single greatest contributor to greenhouse gas emissions and as a result, climate change, it frustrated me that there weren't more people taking action to address this issue through the science. However, there was no one to blame, because my perception before turning vegan was exactly the same. But this conversation prompted my realization that due to its supposed inaccessibility, many people avoid even attempting to abstain from meat. So my immediate response was to address this misconception. And given that social media has transformed the way we consume information, I saw a chance to capitalize on this change. That day, I went home and imported all the photos I'd taken of vegan food into a photo editing app. And a few hours of editing later, my Instagram account, CISHK, was born. I began posting photos once a day to provide people with varied options. And although it started as a small project, the reach of these images far surpassed my expectations. What began as a platform for local people searching for options soon escalated into a guide for visitors from all around the world, including Australia, the US, and the UK. I started receiving messages from people thanking me for my recommendations, and sometimes for even helping them become vegan. At first, it was almost laughable. How could such a small task garner such a large response? But what I realized is that amidst the frantic nature of our everyday lives, people value convenience, and that's exactly what I was giving them. Without having to verbally convince anyone, I was helping people realize that veganism was an easy option. However, I wasn't always comfortable with the idea that you don't need verbal activism to bring about change. Around the time when I first became vegan, my friend Stella, a long-term vegan, had made the decision to turn pescatarian. There were many underlying reasons for this decision, but whatever it was, I respected it and admired her for being able to avoid meat for so many years. However, when she told another friend about this decision, her friend had a very different response. She said, "I guess you were never a real vegan to start with." I was shocked. Stella hadn't touched meat in years and she wasn't considered a real vegan. But it turns out that because she never overtly tried to convince anyone to do the same, that she was deemed less vegan. So after this incident, I felt a piercing sense of incompetence. Was I not a real vegan because I was being too complacent about my beliefs that should be shared? For a while, I thought I was betraying my values and felt insecure for doing things the wrong way. But after a period of reflection, I remembered why I avoided this approach in the first place. Many of us, myself included, are taught to think that if we bombard someone with negative statistics, that they're bound to change their behavior. We often resort to moral arguments, saying things like, "You should do this because it's the right thing to do." However, after watching people hopelessly preach their beliefs to a disinterested audience, I believe that the use of these arguments is generally ineffective. Scaring people into action only leaves them less hopeful and more defensive. So, instead of verbally judging people for their lack of initiative, something that we can all do is inspire their curiosity so that they're willing to learn about the cause themselves. by creating resources that were accessible to everyone through Instagram, I gave others the chance to take agency over how much knowledge they chose to consume. The goal was not to turn everyone vegan, but instead to show people that it was possible. Because with everyone who decided, hey, that looks good, I want to try more of these restaurants, they would then go on to bring their friends and family. Their friends and family would then bring their friends and family. And then as a result, small-scale action would accumulate into large-scale movement. And while that may not sound like a huge deal, for everyone who turns fully vegan, 401,500 gallons of water, 14,600 grams of grain, and 10,950 square feet of land are preserved in just a year. Thus, one of the most difficult things for me to hear is when people claim that their individual actions won't make a difference. Like ripples expanding across the water, an effect from an initial state can be followed outwards incrementally. By transforming something I was already doing into a method of indirect activism, I was slowly starting to realize that our actions, regardless of how simple, will always carry weight. And we all have the potential to initiate that ripple. However, there's no one-size-fits-all approach to activism. You might not enjoy social media publicity, so instead, your method of activism could be through designing creative solutions to problems that matter. For example, in response to the growing issue of climate change and environmental degradation, Patrick O'Brien addressed this concern through his creation of the Impossible Patty. The Impossible Burger, if you're not familiar, is not your conventional veggie burger. It's a scientific invention that delivers an almost identical look, taste, and scent to a regular burger, except it's made entirely out of plants. This burger was designed to demonstrate that eating a plant-based alternative can be just as fulfilling, and it enables people to advocate for change through their everyday purchases. People generally stick to default behavior unless given another option. Making rational decisions is time-consuming, so it makes sense that we resort to shortcuts. Ultimately, the most effective interventions make ideal behavior come easily, and O'Brien did exactly that. He created an alternative that could substitute for meat consumption. It was a supply-side change that didn't play on people's morals in order to win. As a scientist, he simply redirected his focus into a field of research that needed studying. And as the trend goes, he applied a passion, transformed it into action, all the while challenging the status quo. So since the launch of the Impossible Patty, they have sold over 13 million burgers worldwide. O'Brien drastically influenced the market for beef without having to bombard anyone with negative statistics, nor having to create an Instagram account that doubled as a guide. Now, not all of us may yield the scientific or creative prowess to design a game-changing burger, but we can always tailor our methods of activism to our own habits or expertise. Just by eating one Impossible Burger in place of what would be a regular meat burger, you can be responsible for saving up to 75 square feet of land, 1 half tub of water, and 18 miles of emissions in a car. And by introducing others to the same option, the effect will simply be amplified. This idea that activism can be manifested through our individual actions is supported by a concept that I learned in psychology class called social cognitive theory. It states that behavior and social norms are learned through the observation of others. These behaviors are acquired, maintained, and changed depending on the social context. And what I discovered while applying this knowledge to real life is that so long as there's a clear motivation behind the behavior, modeling behavior that we hope to see replicated can be an effective way to promote change. For example, ever since I learned about the harm of marine debris on the marine life and their habitats, I've made sure to ask the waiter for no straw every time I order a drink. More recently, I started carrying around my own stainless steel reusable straw in place of what would be a single-use plastic straw. I don't always feel the need to use a straw, but when I do it to make a statement. Sometimes it'll engender questioning looks, but it also prompts discussion. This communicates to the waiters and the people that I'm with that I, as a consumer, am demanding change. And if the shop owners or producers are unwilling to shift their behavior, we have the capacity to prevent further harm by starting with our individual actions. Now, whenever I go down the hill for a meal at one of the local restaurants, the waiter will say, "You yam tong," sometimes before I remember to say it myself. Other waiters will overhear and might even giggle a bit, but this, to me, is change. This signifies that they recognize the shift in demand and hopefully the reality that their straws aren't wanted. Whereas in the past, speaking up about these issues would seem a little daunting and uncomfortable, this practice has now been normalized. Sometimes, my friends who are eating with me will also remember to ask for no straw before I do. And although some might classify this as a form of guilt tripping, I prefer to frame it as leading by example. There's another term I learned in psychology class last year that has stuck with me ever since. It's called Reciprocal Determinism, and it's defined as the idea that an individual is both influenced by and exerts an influence on their environment. This means that society and culture can influence individuals, but individuals can also influence society and culture. I believe that this applies perfectly to what I've discussed today, because as explored in the past three examples, having an intention behind our actions can inspire others to do the same. Going back to the idea of activism, I'd like to propose an alternate definition. These issues of climate change and environmental degradation are colossal, and tackling them is difficult. But activism can be exemplified in so many different ways. My personal experience with activism involves making vegan options accessible to people and for modeling behavior that I hope to see replicated. But yours will most likely be very different. But whether it's asking for no straw, bringing your own reusable container, or taking your friends to eat the Impossible Burger, how we live our lives can act as a catalyst for change. So if there's one thing I hope you can take away from this talk today, is that your actions matter. I hope that one day we can find ourselves sitting around a table, eating the Impossible Burger, and saying, I can't believe that in 2019, people doubted that their individual actions could instigate change. Thank you.